You found product market fit, but now the systems are cracking. The team needs you for everything. Growth feels like quicksand. The more you move, the deeper it pulls you in. This is the scaling paradox, where founders and operators come to get unstuck. I'm Blake Moseni, and I sit down with founders and operators that nearly burnt out and rebuilt their business to operate without them. If you're stuck in the middle, this is where we fix it. What would you say characterizes a super strong pitch versus one that maybe isn't as robust or seems weaker?
The number one thing is confidence. And I realized that was a problem that I had even when launching Fanbasis originally, because I wasn't as confident in the product at the time. I really did like the idea, but the product itself was still kind of in its like MVP beta stage. It was easier for me to raise some of that family and friends around before we had anything. And then once we had the product, everyone wants to see a demo and look at it. And I knew there was a lot of room for improvement, which kind of bled into my pitch a bit as well. I was less confident. As soon as we actually got to that point, everything changed. And even the tonality that I had when pitching was totally different. In reality, I think confidence is one of the number one things that you have to focus on. And then another mistake a lot of people make is focusing on the details too much, like talking about the traction. Oh, look, we achieved this, this, and this. We have these partnerships in place. This is our go-to-market strategy. And going into detail is not a bad thing. It's more of don't lose sight from the fact that you are painting a narrative and pitching a story. And the story is kind of what is the most important part of this whole thing. It's not what were you able to achieve, is why does this matter?
Hello and welcome to another episode of The Scaling Paradox. On today's episode, we have Yash Daftary, the CEO and founder of Fanbasis. He launched his first venture at 16 years old and achieved his first exit by 18. Prior to founding Fanbasis, Yash was the investor at a top-tier venture capital firm, including Storm Ventures and MBX Capital, where he developed a sharp understanding of startup growth and scalability and market positioning. He has since raised over $20 million for Fanbasis and built several high-performing info product businesses alongside running a successful performance marketing agency. This blend of investing, operating, and building gives Yash a rare full stack perspective on the needs of modern digital entrepreneurs. Yash, it is so exciting to have you on today's episode today.
I appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely, man. I'm looking forward to really unpacking what you've lived through since the age of 16. You've pitched to hundreds of different investors and individuals. You've heard no hundreds of times, and you've now grown Fanbasis to over $1 billion run rate, which is spectacular. So I know the listeners are so excited to hear about really that science of pitching to startups and fundraising.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to dive into it. I have a little bit of a unique perspective on fundraising and pitching in general, given that, been doing it since I was 14 years old, and, I've sat on both sides of the table. Obviously, as an investor on the venture side, listened to thousands of different pitches, and then, was able to take what I learned there to pitch myself. And, that was a complete different beast of its own. And, I've gone through that process with several different iterations and, kind of seen the evolution of a pitch as it pertains to different stages of a company as well.
Absolutely, man. But before we start to unpack that, I do want the listeners to get to know you on a little bit more of a personal level. Outside of work, which I know you do a lot of, what do you do for fun? Like, what is an exciting weekend that isn't grinding on Fanbasis?
To be completely honest with you, yeah. I would say most weekends I'm here for at least some time, for fun. At this point, I do like to play sports and things like golf, padel, things like that. And outside of that, for entertainment, I'm usually going out with some sort of clients. All my friends are clients as well in some sort of capacity. Go to a nice dinner, live in Miami, so there's a lot of places to kind of where you can go out, have a good time, and not have to actually go to a club and party. But honestly, right now, there's nothing that I would rather do than kind of be at the office and get things done.
100%. Nothing better than building what you're most passionate about, and some good eats are also always a good benefit. What's the best restaurant you've been to in Miami?
A couple of my favorite restaurants are Mila. It's a great spot in South Beach. Osaka, I think, has some of the best Japanese food that I've ever had in my life. I'd say those are probably the two better recommendations I usually give people.
Awesome. Well, I will. I'm going to take you up on visiting one of those locations next time I'm in Miami. We can grab some sushi together. Awesome, man. Let's jump into things. It would be good to understand. So you've been pitching since you were 15, and as I said, you've heard no literally hundreds of times, and you've also said no hundreds of times. So, what did those early no's teach you that you did not necessarily understand at the time? Like you built these calluses throughout your life and your career. If you were to go back to your younger self and give yourself advice on those on what those no's mean, what would you share?
Yeah, there's a couple different reasons why someone would say no when you're pitching to them, right? One, when I was 14 years old or 15 years old, it was a lot of the time because I was 14 or 15 years old, which, at the time I would beat myself up over it. But if a 14 or 15-year-old, 16-year-old pitched anything to me, I don't care if, they're coming off as the next Elon Musk, I'm probably not going to invest and I'm going to say
Sure.
no.
Hmm.
So a lot of my feedback then was, hey, you've got a great idea. It seems like the product is really cool, but you're basically inexperienced. Is kind of what the gist of it was. And then after launching Fanbasis when I was a little bit older, started pitching this product and company when I was 20. I was old enough to where age wasn't an absolute barrier, but still young enough to where had to prove my experience. So at that point, and it really varies at the different stages of a company. Some people told me, one of my mentors told me, and this actually stuck, the best time to pitch investors is actually pre-product when you just have the idea. Because
Hmm.
once you have a product live and active, everything's about the KPIs and what progress and traction you've been able to achieve. If you do it pre-product, then you basically just need to sell them on the idea. How good are you at sales? That's really what it's coming down to. So, but once you launch it, so the objections kind of change. When it's pre-idea, they're trying to poke holes in the idea. If you can make it as bulletproof as possible, all you're doing is convincing someone to believe in the vision that you have.
Sure.
And at the end of the day, that's what a pitch is, right? Can you get them to believe in the vision, and can you make the opportunity big enough for whoever's sitting across the table from you? An angel investor might not be looking for 1,000x every single time they invest in a business. If you can prove to them that you can give them a 2 to 3x on their money within a couple of years, they'll be happy with that. But go and raise a seed round or a Series A. If you're talking to an institutional investor at that point, you need to convince them that you're going to IPO, and you're looking at a 10, 50, $100 billion opportunity. And you also have to convince them that you're the person to build that. The earlier the stages when it comes to a pitch, the more reliant on yourself as kind of the jockey on a horse you are. Are you the person to take this to whatever stage it might be? When we were in venture capital, that was kind of the primary thing that we were looking at, because we were investing in seed and Series A companies. There were so many times where we were like, wow, the idea is so good. The traction's there. They're finding product market fit. It's the perfect time to invest. But we don't see the founders and the founding team as the guys to actually bring this to the next level and get it to the point where, these guys are not looking for a 2 to 3x. They're investing in 10 companies within their, 10 companies a year. And out of that, they're hoping that 1 to 2 of them actually are winners and are home runs. They don't care if the other 8 or 9 fail. So, every single company they invest in, they're trying to make the bet of, hey, this one is going to be a unicorn. And it really varies kind of per stage and per stage that you're at and kind of where, your product traction stack looks like.
Absolutely. And I love the call out of pitch before the product is actually finalized. Like that is super salient. And I think it is something absolutely to consider, especially a lot of people want to hold off till they have something tangible because they feel like they don't have something to actually talk about. And so as you've gone through these iterations, you've noticed different trends, you called out some different dynamics of how well you're doing from a sales standpoint and how you can position the product from an opportunity. What would you say characterizes a super strong pitch versus one that maybe isn't as robust or seems weaker?
Yeah, it's a good question. The number one thing is confidence. And I realized that was a problem that I had even when launching Fanbasis originally, because I wasn't as confident in the product at the time. I really did like the idea, but the product itself was still kind of in its like MVP beta stage, and it was easier for me to raise some of that family and friends round before we had anything, and then once we had the product, everyone wants to see a demo and look at it, and I knew there was a lot of room for improvement, which kind of bled into my pitch a bit as well. I knew that the product could be better, so I was less confident. Once we kind of kept iterating and really found that product market fit, there was nothing that anyone could say that, could make me believe that we didn't have the best product in the space. So as soon as we actually got to that point, everything changed. And even the tonality that I had when pitching was totally different, something that was just completely subconscious. So in reality, I think confidence is one of the number one things
Sure.
that you have to focus on. And then second is another mistake a lot of people make is focusing on the details too much. Like, you're talking about the traction. Oh, look, we achieved this, this, and this. We have these partnerships in place. This is our go-to-market strategy, and going in detail on it. And going into detail is not a bad thing. It's more of, don't lose sight from the fact that you are painting a narrative and pitching a story. And the story is kind of what is, the most important part of this whole thing. It's not what were you able to achieve, is why does this matter? An extremely respected mentor in the venture capital space, and every time we're going to raise something or we create a new deck, I always run everything by him and run it through my pitch. And last time I did that, we probably worked on this deck for about a month, and practiced it a bunch of times. Everything was great. Showed it to a couple of people. I brought it to him, and he just kept saying, like, he's like, why does this matter? I'd say, for this X, Y, and Z reason. He's like, nope, why does this actually matter? And we ended up redoing the whole pitch after that, because we were like, shit, like, this is really showcasing what we've done well, but it's not showing the why it matters. Why does this make a difference? And that's where, if you want someone that's like a tier one and a really good venture fund, like, they're not going to invest in you unless they think you're going to be the next Uber or the next Airbnb. And you're not going to be the next Uber or an Airbnb if you don't truly understand why this matters to just everyone and not yourself.
I really appreciate the push to step away from the details. And it kind of goes back to the confidence thing, right? It's like when you're so caught up in the details, it's almost as though you're trying to justify why you deserve a seat at the table versus just showing up saying, this is my seat and here's why. It's just a little bit of a mindset shift there. And so you called out some tactical call outs around, hey, focus more on the why you, why now, and paint that broader story. What I'd really like to key into specifically is the notion of how do we make the notion of confidence more tangible for the listeners? Obviously, some people have different varying degrees of confidence. Someone just walks in a room and can own the room. Someone doesn't have that same sort of skill set. Mm-hmm. But for those listeners that are great operators, they are doing all the right things and they have a solid business and idea that they're continuing to grow, but they're struggling on the confidence piece. How would you coach them to improve that?
At that point, you really got to lean into what you're good at. If as a venture fund, like, you also at the same time, confidence and all of that helps sell, but everyone's also looking for the next Zuck to invest in, right?
Sure.
So if you're really good and you're a cracked CEO/CTO, lean into that super heavy. If you can show them that you're an absolute expert in your space and the industry that you're working in, now that's what you're trying to convince them of, and you should be confident in that if you are actually an expert. So it's really being hyper confident in what you're good at. That's the most important part. Now, if you're not good at sales and you're not confident and you don't have any hard skills, then find someone else to do the pitch for you, because you're gonna struggle a bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really appreciate the idea that everyone has a different zone of genius. Understand what that zone is and be prepared to go have those conversations. And this kind of ties back to some of the earlier pieces that we were talking about. So it's like, okay, someone has honed in on their zone of genius. They've committed to say, this is how I'm going to pitch. This is how I'm going to go have this broader conversation. How prepared should people be to hear no? And how many no should they be prepared to hear in pursuit of whatever they're trying to build? Obviously, that varies depending on the product, depending on the person, based off what you've experienced and what you've seen other people experience when pitching their organizations. What's industry standard?
Look, I before I got a yes for our seed round, I probably had about 200 something no's. So, for me, grit is something that, is definitely a strong suit of mine. Like, I don't really take no for an answer to begin with, and I view it as their loss, really, when it comes to conversations like that. If you're going to go in and have an expectation that you're going to speak to 20 people and, if that doesn't work, you're going to call it a day, then this is not the right kind of job or role responsibility for you. When it comes to, how many no's should they be willing to accept, it really depends. They could speak to the first investor, and if it's a great fit, they've got a phenomenal product and they're able to explain the vision and opportunity well, they can get a yes on their first try. I've seen that happen. But, if it's a little bit of a different scenario and, there are skeletons in the closet, or, it's a competitive landscape or whatever it might be, there's no magic number here that they should be prepared for. You need to just be prepared to take in, as many no's that it takes you to get a yes. Really, that's what it comes down to.
I love the call out of grit and the need to be relentless along the way.
If you're getting a lot of no's too, another thing that's super helpful is and you obviously, once you have a conversation with different VC funds, like, you can start getting a vibe for how well the conversation went, right? And if it's going to be a no or a yes, I usually just ask them up front, kind of at the end of the call, like, hey, just curious, like, what are you thinking here? Just sake of saving everyone's time, because I don't want to waste my time either. And just ask them if it is like, oh, I don't think this is the right fit for whatever reasons, wrong industry or whatever it might be. I usually just ask them why and how do you think I could improve this, and get feedback from your target audience. It's the same thing as customer research in a sense.
How much should someone take into account the feedback from the conversations that they're having and changing the structure and narrative of what they're pitching, or to stay true to what you believe is the message and the story of what you're trying to build and raise money for?
So look, a lot of the venture guys and investors you're speaking with have never built a business on their own. So it's important to take some of the feedback with a grain of salt. With that being said, they're also looking at a lot of different businesses every day, and they are making investments in certain companies. If you're speaking to a VC fund that has a phenomenal track record and you spoke to a partner that actually has exited a business in the past and they give you some feedback, you should probably take that to heart and say, okay, this is important for me to, kind of think about. At the end of the day, 95% of startups fail. So, if you're getting consistent feedback from everyone around the same things, great. You know what you need to fix. Now, go back to the same exact people and be like, hey, we actually fixed this. Go 6 months later. I've had that happen too, where, I've had investors that have come in and wrote large checks for us that, I pitched probably 3 times before they actually ended up investing. So, managing these guys as leads is kind of important as well. I had actually like a whole CRM that I use just for investor tracking and management. So, that's one thing to note. Second is, you might want to figure out, like, if you're struggling to get traction and you're pitching to people and they're not really liking the idea for XYZ reason, and those reasons kind of include like industry or market size, that's something where you might want to really consider that and be like, okay, does it make sense to pivot this into something that has a larger opportunity at hand, or whatever it might be, because these guys aren't stupid either, right? Maybe some of them are, but a lot of them are hyper intelligent as well, especially if you're speaking to an associate or an analyst from like a top fund. They're very, very intelligent people. Definitely evaluate kind of what they're saying. And I think I've seen a mistake for companies that I mentor too, of like, they pitch and they're like, oh yeah, this investor said no, but like, their feedback was BS. And then I go through a recording of the call and I'm like, honestly, they made some really valid points. There are actually things that we should think about. They're referencing some of the other competitors in the space. You obviously, like, if you're going to an investor, a lot of the times they have a portfolio of companies that are in an industry that you're trying to break into or you're already operating in. So they have a lot more insight than you do, most likely, if that's the case. There's definitely a fine balance there. What these guys say is not set in stone. If you're super confident that they're wrong, then, you have to be confident and believe in yourself. But, at the same time, like, there is a lot of value that you can get out of these conversations as well.
Yeah, it's like you have to have a certain degree of conviction around your product and your organization while taking in input on where and how to make shifts and changes.
Exactly.
It's really the notion of like when do you pivot your product, right? And we could get into some of that from a Fanbasis standpoint, but before we do, I think it would be good to hear. Okay, so you've gone through literally 200 pitches to get Fanbasis the funding that it has received and to scale it to a $1 billion GMV. It would be good to understand how you tweaked your pitch over time based off the feedback that you received through those conversations.
Yeah. I mean, there was a lot of tweaking. For my seed round, I think we had 27 versions of the same deck. I started A/B testing things when, I think after I was like 100 pitches.
Such a product guy. Keep going. I love it.
I was seeing, okay, what angles are, getting me that second conversation or the third conversation versus what's not, and then leaning into those things a little bit more. The main things that I would kind of focus on, and what I would like do now, we're probably going to go and raise a Series B soon, is on the story piece. Like, am I able to get across the opportunity at hand here? Am I convincing these guys that it's $100 billion plus opportunity and we are going to be the Amazon for the internet economy? Or is that not, being conveyed well enough? So that's, for me, what, that's how I'm thinking about it. At the end of the day, the designs on the slides matter just a little bit. It needs to look decent. And obviously, I like things to look really, really nice. So we definitely try our best on that front and focus on it, but it really doesn't matter. Like, we've been a part of investments in companies that probably made their deck in 30 minutes on PowerPoint and had no design whatsoever, but the business was really, really strong. So, it depends on kind of what you think you're lacking in the pitch, and kind of just tweaking things around that. If you see that, like, there's one slide in particular that you're getting a lot of questions on, maybe evaluate that a little bit further and figure out, how you can maybe change that slide or add something else. Or, a lot of times, like, a big mistake people make is just over explaining in a deck. The deck is supposed to give just a high level update, but it's also not supposed to give extremely in-depth insight into the business. Like, you as the founder or the presenter needs to be the one that's kind of providing that color, but use the deck as, the way to steer the conversation. I raised our Series A without a deck, and, seed round, we had a deck, but we wouldn't, even show it to people on the pitch. I think there's pros and cons to that strategy. I'm really good at relationship building and selling, so that's kind of what we leaned into a little bit more. But when I go for a Series B, given that, like, now with a Series B, it starts to be growth stage investing, and it's less about, obviously the vision and mission and all of that matters a lot, but there's a lot of data that people do want to see, especially for a business like ours. So having a deck and presenting it is super important, because it also kind of creates the agenda for the meeting, quote unquote agenda, but it and drives and steers the conversation to make sure that it is going down the exact narrative that you want it to, and not, a bunch of tangents that come up because of random conversations and questions that are being asked in the middle of the pitch. So yeah.
I appreciate what you started to call out here, and I'd like to unpack it a little bit further. So you're calling out the idea that depending on the stage that the company is in, the pitching strategy changes substantially. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what I'm inferring is seed round or Series A is more about the vision and what the organizational objective is trying to achieve versus trying to get into core user metrics, unless those are like insanely strong, like the early days of Facebook and how sticky that product was. And then looking at different stages, it would be good to understand where and how your pitching strategy changes, or you've seen different pitching strategies change from B2C and so on and so forth from there.
Yeah. No, you're definitely, you're definitely not wrong. But to add to it, the vision and mission is extremely important in all stages, 100%. Want to make that clear. But, in the beginning stages, it's really, making sure that you're showing that the vision that you have for the business will help the investor achieve their goals, which is usually in, over proportion return, given that it's a high risk investment. They're gambling on, multiple companies like yours, hoping that one of them is going to hit and make it big, right? I only know of one investor that, has a portfolio of over a dozen angel investment that's hit on all of them. It's crazy. So, at the end of the day, when you're going into kind of a Series A, the Series A, it really starts, but with a B and a C is, that's when it gets super important. And like, how good of a job are you doing at not only pitching the vision and the mission and helping them understand that this is a, IPO-able company, because that's what they're looking for at this stage, but also, you have to show them all the data. You need to be really, really bundled up with a nice data room, have everything completely, outline, do as much of the transactional work for them as you can, because if you're doing the transactional work, you're showing your cohort analyses, your product data, raw transaction level data, and packaging it yourself. You can definitely, present it in the way that suits your company and business the best, compared to if they're going to be doing it on their own. They're going to just look at it from whatever perspective they have. So it can make a huge difference if you're able to bring in someone that can build you a nice data room. My CFO does that for me. But the overall strategy and just nature of the pitch becomes different altogether, because investors at each stage are looking for different things.
You talked a little bit about data rooms and metrics. Are there particular metrics that you think are universal, regardless of business type, stage of business, that are important to really emphasize and have a handle on?
Retention is one of them, customer retention. If you're able to show really, really strong retention, that proves to be a business that's not reliant on just new things coming out and acquiring new customers at all times. Outside of that, I really do think it is industry specific to what makes the most sense. Obviously, revenue in general and things of that nature always going to be looked at revenue, profit, net revenue, GMV if applicable, but it depends on the industry. Obviously, an AI company can have $0 in revenue, be burning $100,000, $500,000 a month, and still raise at a multi-nine-figure valuation. So that's totally different than a business that's running at a 3% margin, pumping in $100 million a year. Yeah, it varies.
Absolutely. You talked a lot about the investor CRM that you've been able to build throughout your career. And now you're at a stage where you've built a network of investors. You have some VC mentors. You have some other friends in the space that you've mentioned throughout today's conversation. For people that are early on in their journey of trying to scale or grow their business or even raise capital, what are the best paths for them to build up that investor network that you've put together?
It's tough. I grinded for, building that out, to be honest. I went to a lot of events. I was going to networking events twice a week just to meet with other founders who can make introductions for me. I really networked hard. And the craziest part is, like, Left Lane, who that did our Series A, like, they just found me on LinkedIn and shot me a message. So didn't come through any of the efforts that I put in directly. With that being said, for my seed round and pre-seed round, 100% of the investments I got were from direct efforts that I made to make sure I got in the right rooms with the right people. There's no blanket advice I can really give there outside of, cold outreach is most likely not going to work in 9.5 out of 10 cases. You really have to go and you have to get warm introductions and you have to actually just meet the right people.
Yeah, it's such a good reminder that the IRL engagement model is still alive and well, and it just takes one, right? Like to your point, you make that one connection and things just spider web out from there. And so it's just being committed to making that having that initial conversation and realizing that things will continue to compound from that point on.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we spent some time. We talked a little bit about how you evaluate pitches and how you've continued to curate your pitch to get yourself through a Series A that is now likely to parlay into a Series B at some point in the future. When looking at trying to scale Fanbasis and seeing when and how things actually clicked, what was the signal that your approach was working? And maybe before we even get into that, it would be good for you to give some historical background for the listeners to understand you were building this for a couple of years, like we were talking about in the preamble. And you had some growth, you were building an agency, and you were trying to figure out how it all fit together. And then you hit this point, this inflection point, where it was just like, we have hit product market fit. Can you talk a little bit about that story?
Yeah, definitely. And to answer your question, how do you know when it's working is when someone actually writes a check.
Yeah, fair. Money is the telltale sign, right?
Once you get one check, it makes it getting more a lot easier. No one wants to get the first or the second,
Yeah.
And if you can get people that actually have good reputations and brands, it makes it a hell of a lot easier.
100%.
But for some background on myself there, I started this when I was working in venture capital space, while I was kind of in college, actually, in a full-time capacity. Saw during COVID the creator economy was blowing up. Looked at the success of platforms like Cameo, Fanatics, Patreon, and decided to build the original version of our product and kind of to innovate in the creator economy and sell celebrity fan experiences. Ended up building out the MVP and launching the first version in 2021, launched our beta in 2022. And, at the same time, I wasn't taking any sort of salary, so I was launching other businesses in addition that I had a marketing agency, for example. I had different info product related businesses. As we continue to scale the core platform of Fanbasis, we saw a couple thousand celebrities, athletes, influencers that were signed up on our platform. Had about 3,500 of them. They were selling different fan experiences like a virtual meet and greet or a follow back on Instagram, ability to learn how to cook from a master chef winner, things of that nature. And the main issue was that their scalability wasn't really there, where to get Dennis Rodman to do 20 virtual meet and greets in a month was a mega pain in the ass. And the top creators on our platform were only making $5,000-$10,000 a month because they were using us as kind of a side income stream. Then eventually started to just open up and broaden the audience a bit, and we started bringing in people that were making $100,000 a month or $50,000 a month, which at that point was a really, really big client for us. So the difference was they were selling more repeatable and scalable business models and products where, they're selling a course or a community or exclusive access to XYZ thing, mentorship call, coaching call. And, they were running their brand like a personal brand, like a real business, utilizing our platform to do that. We kind of doubled down into it because I also had some of these kinds of businesses on the side, and I wanted to use Fanbasis architecture to kind of run and host those businesses as well. So ended up doing that and realized there was a lot of room for improvement in a lot of different areas for more digital products and services rather than fan experiences. And as soon as we kind of started pivoting the focus of our business to going after internet entrepreneurs, creators, experts, rather than like influencers, we immediately saw that product market fit.
What a journey, and what a shift to be able to shift from like the athletes or the professionals of certain businesses or industries to more of a creative focused lens. I think it would be good for the listeners to hear how you traverse that unknown, right? Because like you had a clear vision in your head that you started out with, and you actually had traction, right? Like you've alluded to Dennis Rodman a couple times in our conversations. I don't know if he was actually on there, but let's hypothetically say that he was. So you had real people on there, real celebrities on there, and then you decided to shift over. Why make that big of a leap?
We tested it, and we were like, let's not go all in on this until we see that it works. And we started to bring on a couple people that had been out of our ICP at that time, and we started seeing that within 2 to 3 months of doing that, our new audience was making more money than the whole existing client base that we have. So basically we were able to triple the size of the business within 3 months, and at that point it was kind of a no-brainer to shift the focus and kind of triple down into what's working and stop focusing on what's not.
So you also brought this up in our preamble, and I do want the listeners to hear it. How long did it take to get from kicking off Fanbasis to actually product market fit and scaling and raising additional capital and things really being off to the races for your business?
So launched the MVP in 2020, in 2021, launched the beta in 2022, grew the business a bit in 2023, and then in 2024 in January we decided to pivot, and by January 2024 we grew the business by over 10x and raised our Series A. So in total I've been doing this almost 6 years now, but realistically, in the last 2 years is kind of when we got all of our traction.
It's funny. Have you heard the bamboo analogy?
No.
Or even the quote that says overnight success that took 10 years, something along those lines.
Yeah.
I feel like it's so apropos for the fan base story, and really any organizational growth story that hits these crazy 10x, 5-10x numbers from a growth standpoint. So the bamboo basically has to grow underground for some crazy amount of time. I want to say it's like 3 years or 5 years. And throughout that period of time, it's actually the roots are continuing to spread further and further out. And then within a 5-week period after you hit that 3 or 5 year mark, whatever it is, it sprouts up 20 or 30 feet in the air. And everyone says how amazing it is how quickly bamboo grows. But in reality, it's been growing for an extended period of time. And it's such a characterization of building a business and going all in and trying to scale something that you truly believe in. So no, I appreciate you giving a little bit of that backstory for the audience to really understand what it took to actually get your organization to where it's at today. As we get ready to wrap some of our conversation today, it would be good to understand what advice would you give to, you mentioned earlier you're doing some coaching, right? And so what advice would you give to young entrepreneurs or people that are in the grind mode of their organization on them trying to traverse and get to that next level for their life and their career?
The number one thing is just do it. If you haven't started the business yet, that's, start the business. Take the leap, because that's where 99% of people get stuck. Now, you pass that first tranche, you go to the second of starting something unique and cool, or building something brand new, building a startup. You're trying to disrupt something or create a product that doesn't exist. Now, you have to be flexible and agile. I've learned just with my own experience. Obviously, we had a crazy pivot. At a point where we had traction, we were profitable, we were already making money, just not as much as we had a mid 7-figure a year GMV run rate. Like, it wasn't as much as what we were hoping for. My eyes have always been on hundreds of millions or billions. So, I had to pivot something that I worked and built a product for multiple years, and, had to be flexible with it because we knew there was a larger opportunity at hand. I see that with other companies all the time. There's one company I'm mentoring right now, and they're banging their heads against a brick wall for probably the last year and a half, 2 years, and they finally took my advice, pivoted the focus of their business, and now, in the last 3 months, they've generated more revenue than they have in the last 2 years. So, being flexible is always something that's important, and being opportunistic. I always say, when you're in the early stages of a company, be a yes man. Always say yes to different ideas, opportunities. Can you guys do this? Yes, I can. Figure the out. Make it happen. Then you get to a point where, you start actually growing, you find product market fit, and then you got to be selective with, you start saying yes when it benefits, more than just one person, one client, one use case. You kind of have to just be smart and strategic with it, but you have to be super open-minded as an entrepreneur to different possibilities, and you have to think about things from a very analytical and logical standpoint, not from an emotional standpoint. If you put your blood, sweat, and tears into something for enough time, it starts to become something that you're attached to and emotional about. But you kind of have to take that out of the picture when you're making decisions, and make a decision that's kind of in the best interest of the business. Take yourself out of the picture. So that's what my advice would be.
I love that. Ego is the enemy. Focus on the entity itself, which is the organization. Continue to find ways to scale it up. Something I've taken away just from our conversations together is you are relentless, and you have like a grit that is unparalleled by most in the world. I'm assuming that the team that you've built, you look for that same level of grit because you have high expectations and a high bar from an execution and delivery standpoint. Once again, you tell me if I'm putting words in your mouth, but that's what I would anticipate.
No, absolutely. That's the number one thing we look for. There's people that are here at our office every single night until 1 or 2 a.m. I was here till 2 a.m. with probably a dozen other people last night. And not everyone can do that, especially like we've got in total almost 90 people now. Like, it's hard to scale a business and have 100 people grinding like that, but the people that excel within the organization and people that kind of have those traits are no-brainer hires. The ones that are going to be ride or dies, and they care about the business as much as you do. There's nothing more valuable than that.
My question can that be taught, or is that just inherent ability that's built into the individuals that you're bringing into your organization?
Absolutely cannot be taught. You can inspire people, but they need to have it in them to do that. They need to really give it.
I appreciate that, man. I have similar views, but I wanted to ask the question, at least for the listeners, to get some of that perspective. And then last question for you: what are you most excited about when you think about what the future has in store? Obviously, we're into 2026, but 2026 and into 2030 and beyond. What are you excited about?
When it comes to Fanbasis and my business in particular, I think that the vision that we've set out for what we're doing this year, and what we're kind of in the process of doing, is we're shifting from, right now we're like a Shopify for digital products and services. We give a lot of different point solutions to help people essentially run their business, and the core value is help them make more money with our platform. We essentially are taking that to the next level and creating a real ecosystem to shift from being like a Shopify to more like an Amazon type of. And there's no product that's ever been able to successfully take that approach and is thinking about it in the way that we are. So I truly believe that we're just probably 2-3 years away from claiming $100 billion opportunity that's ours. So that's what I'm excited about.
Yash, it was so awesome to hear your frame on pitching, how to scale organizations, and what your journey has been like with Fanbasis. I know the listeners have gotten a lot of amazing nuggets out of all the things that you've shared, and looking forward to future chats with you and having you out on the podcast at some point in the future.
Absolutely. No, I appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely, man. That's it for this episode of The Scaling Paradox. If this helped cut through the chaos, please send it to another founder or operator that's stuck in it too. If you haven't subscribed yet, let's fix that. New episodes of The Scaling Paradox drop every other Thursday. There's no filler in this podcast, just the real work of scaling past yourself.